Chapter 14 goes into more depth in terms of how evolution occurs, but this time at an increased scale. Now remember, all the things we're talking about here are based on microevolution. Microevolution, which we have just shown to work and which we've just shown happens, and we looked at the various mechanisms by which it can happen. And so when it comes to biological diversity, meaning now not just population changing over time, populations, yes, but now what happens if you have multiple species? How do they evolve? What is a species even? And so let me give you a little bit of an introduction to that. This is the study of macroevolution. So this is when the increments of microevolution amount to something bigger. Now there are clearly some major biological changes that you see, whether it's in the fossil record or whether you look at different organisms the way they exist today. And the idea is if somehow they all have a common ancestor, then obviously there must be some major changes that have taken place. And one of the things that people have had problems with is to try and figure out what those changes are and how you can get from A to B when a change is occurring. This would be, for example, the idea of how do you get to something like the human eye? How do you get there? If that's B, well, where does it come from? Where is the A? And we sometimes don't know these things. And it turns out over the last century or so, we have been able to document a lot of these changes, and we've been able to identify a lot of the A's. And a lot of the B's are not straight jumps from an A to a B, but there are a lot of things in between the A and the B. And so when you consider, let's say, evolution, we know now how it progressed. We know that there was something that was basically just a simple little photosensitive cell, and then that eventually turned into a cup eye, and then there were several steps, and you can follow all those steps so you can still see them in development, or you can see them out in nature and you end up with something that's like our eye. And there are structural features that tell us why our eye is the way it is and that we have a blind spot and so on. And that's because we now understand better how macroevolution actually works. One of the mechanisms to discuss as part of macroevolution is how do you end up with different species. Now remember, we just came off chapter 13, and in chapter 13, the last diagram showed you something that was what I call diversifying selection. It was where you started with a single peak and you ended up with two peaks. It's disruptive selection in another name. Speciation can be thought of driving something to diversify to an extreme, where the things have become so diverse that they can't go back. That's speciation. And so you can see, based on that diagram from chapter 13, how speciation fits into this. And the reason why it is important is because that's sort of the step that gets you past the population level. It gets you past the point of no return, if you will. And in order to investigate that, we're going to look at two patterns. There's non-branching and branching speciation. Let's start with the first one. This is non-branching evolution. And in non-branching evolution, you would take the population that you begin with. So here, we may call this the ancestral population. And this ancestral population exists in an ancestral environment. And then things happen. Things happen here, things happen there, things happen here. Whatever happens along this trajectory creates a change in this ancestral population. And incrementally, with small little increments, driven by microevolution, you end up with something that is distinct. And so part of the issue with species is to recognize whether you can tell two things apart. Now, if you look at these two birds, there are clearly characteristics that you could use to tell them apart. I mean, perhaps you're looking at color. Perhaps you're looking at the beak. There are a variety of features, clearly. And so if this is your A and this is your B, you not only have a non-branching pattern here, you go from one place to the next, you also can imagine that there might be some steps in the middle here, but you may not necessarily know what those steps are. But that's okay, you just start with one and you can end up with another. Now that is a little bit like taking your peak, your normal distribution that we saw at the end of chapter 13, and moving it in a certain direction. We call that directional selection. So one of the outcomes of directional selection may be speciation, where you take that direction so far that it's not going back. So you've gone from A to B and it's not going back. That would be non-branching evolution. Let's take the second pattern, branching evolution. Branching evolution also starts with population A, but in this case you retain population A and then you have another population B. And the reason why you have population B is because of something that happened here. That's your branching point. Something happened right here that drove the one population into this direction and allowed the other to stay the same. Now normally what that means is that a subset of this population, we call A, moved somewhere else, perhaps to an island. So this could be a model for what happened to these Galapagos finches. Maybe population A is the thing that you saw on the mainland, and it's still population A today because nothing changed. But this branch here, they flew out to the islands. For whatever reason, they ended up on these islands, and there on these islands they changed because the islands are different. There's a different environment that has an impact on the population, and the incremental steps also took place along the way. Maybe this initial branching event, if there was an instant, that was when these birds drifted off course and flew all the way to the Galapagos Islands. Who knows? The point is that we have an instance where this remains the same and one changes. And so in this case, one of the things you may say is, okay, well, we have this peak, and that's where we start. But now, in addition to having that peak, we have a second peak. So peak number one, that was always there, but now we have an additional peak. It is also possible to think of branching evolution that you end up with two different kinds of birds. So here is A, then something happens here, that's your branching point, and you end up maybe with B and C. You see how that's different, right? You don't have A anymore. Here you still have A. But you don't have to have A anymore, but instead you end up with B and C. And so in that case, it may be that you started with something we call A, and over time you ended up with B and C. Remember, these are the graphs that I showed you earlier, the outcomes of natural selection. So those would be the examples for branching evolution. Now there's no way to say which one of these is more frequent or which one happens to those kind of organisms but never to those. There's probably a combination of all of this that ended up producing the diversity we see today, but we definitely see diversity, and the way we see it gives us patterns that make these kind of branching events very important, because in each case you have a common ancestor, and more about that later. Now, one of the things that people have struggled with is to actually define what a species is. It's all very nice to say that you have these characteristics in the one population and those characteristics shift, but then when do you call it a new species? I mean, if you think of humans, right, we can divide ourselves into different groupings based on maybe language, based on what we look like, based on where we come from. We have all kinds of labels that we can attach to human populations, but does that mean that any of it is a species? So that's a question we can ask. Well, if we're trying to make that decision, we have to start somewhere. We have to come up with a definition of species. And when people started to really study diversity and realize that diversity in the present and diversity in the past are not the same, but they're perhaps related, there were all kinds of things that were thrown around in terms of defining species. And really the person who started bringing it all together was this gentleman. His name was Ernst Mayr. And as you can see from the time he lived, he led a very long and productive life through the time when we first started to understand more about how evolution worked, through the time when we learned about Mendelian genetics and genetics in general in terms of chromosomes and so on, through the time when we learned all the different models for population genetics, Hardy-Weinberg and so on. And so he was somebody, he had all the details at his fingertips. And he also, like Darwin, like Wallace, he went out and about. He did some field research. He did field research in the 1920s in New Guinea, and he was one of the people who recognized the incredible diversity of birds of paradise, for example. And when he came back to Harvard University with all his materials, he realized that there was a pattern there. And he was trying to figure out what this pattern was and how you can best describe the pattern and then how you can best put it into some kind of definition. And Mayr came up with something called the biological species concept. And when he came up with this biological species concept, he never made the claim that this is the way we need to think of species. But he thought of it as a departure point. Based on these findings, he thought we could come up with refinements of the definition if needed. We could certainly recognize what a species should be, and he hoped that we could build on this, and that's essentially what happened. Now, if you look at this BSC, biological species concept, by his definition, a species was defined as a group of interbreeding natural populations that is reproductively isolated from other such groups. So the key terms here are interbreeding. So as long as things are interbreeding, they would therefore be of the same species. But when they become reproductively isolated, then you would call them a distinct species. And then, of course, he listed some examples. Today, we can see many examples, but we realize that in some cases, species are very diverse, such as the human species, but all human races and all human populations are still able to interbreed. And that's why we call that species Homo sapiens, and there are no other species. Secondly, in some cases, you find that there are species that are very similar, but for one reason or other, they cannot interbreed. And so, even though things look similar, they must have passed some certain threshold, which means they now are to be considered separate species. And there are many examples where you can clearly say, aha, these populations, they cannot interbreed, they are reproductively isolated, and therefore, based on the biological species concept, we would consider these different species. So this is a very good departure point. The problem is, and people recognize this very quickly, Mayr himself admitted this, that this was not a universally applicable concept. This is always a problem. It's the same problem with the theory of evolution. Sometimes you find things and you say, well, how does that really work with this concept? And it takes a little bit of thought to put it together. Now, in the case of asexual organisms, they are by definition reproductively isolated, right? If you are an individual and you reproduce asexually based on this biological species concept, that would make you, the individual, your own species. But that's clearly not how this is supposed to be interpreted, because you can see that there are, let's say, strawberries. We call that a strawberry plant, but not each individual plant should be considered its own species just because they reproduce asexually. Or there are some populations of lizards out here in the desert, and they reproduce with only females. So there are no males in the entire population. Well, female and female don't reproduce with each other, so they are, by definition, reproductively isolated. But that doesn't mean they should all be considered individual species. That's not the point. They still look the same, they still work the same, they have the same features, they have the same genetics. And so in this case, the biological species concept fails. Secondly, what if we cannot test whether things are reproductively compatible? How would we deal with it then? And so obviously, if it's a fossil, it's extinct, how are you going to determine if it is different from another kind of fossil? You can't make an assessment, you can't make an experiment of whether they are reproductively compatible or not. And so these are problems that the biological species concept cannot overcome. While we might recognize that this is a useful definition, because for certain kinds of organisms, clearly these tests can be done, for others it just doesn't work. So what do we do in that case? Well, we have to figure something else out. We have to look into this relationship between organisms, and since we've always talked about one generation to the next, to the next, to the next, these relationships are ancestry-descendant relationships. Ancestry-descendant relationships, just like a family tree, and therefore they're evolutionary, no matter if those individuals are still alive or not. Think of your own family tree. Clearly, it's not possible to determine whether people from this family in the past and that family from the past were somehow reproductively compatible. But we would assume they are because of what they produced, and the offspring are now reproductively compatible. So perhaps the parents were as well, right? And that's an argument based on ancestry descendants. And that's basically an evolutionary relationship. And so if you do this, we call that the evolutionary species concept, where you go one step beyond and you say, okay, it's not necessary to have these things alive or dead, but one of the things we can do is we can investigate the pattern of where things came from, and perhaps that is going to give us a viable species concept. And so perhaps when you look at a branching pattern, so here is your branching pattern. Once you have two different branches, then maybe these different branches should be considered separate species. Whereas if it's still all one branch, then you call it all one species. So it's trying to figure out, am I on one branch or am I on two branches? That's what the evolutionary species concept does. And that turns out to be a more useful definition for somebody like me who is trying to determine whether something is a new species of gecko that has never been given a name before and has never been recognized as such. And so what you do is you try and ensure that it is an evolutionary lineage that is clearly definable. So if it has different claws, and different scales, and different colors, and all kinds of differences, well, at some point you'll say, okay, it can't be the same thing. So you have to make that argument. You have to make that case that maybe they look similar because at some point they had this common ancestor, but now they don't. So I'm going to call one A and the other one is going to be called B, and that gives me justification and confidence to describe it as a new species. And that's the process I have to go through. Now, ultimately, is there any proof? The proof would be, perhaps, to try and see if these can reproduce or not. But in many cases, that's not really very helpful because I have museum specimens. It would be very difficult for me to go to some of the islands where some of these specimens came from and another one, and then grab a few, try and somehow make them breed, and then make my decision based on that. That's not very practical. And certainly when we have populations that go extinct because of deforestation and so on, then that becomes a problem in itself. And so ultimately, when you describe a species, you are erecting a new hypothesis for diversity in that group. So I have these geckos, and as part of this group of geckos, I am hypothesizing that this thing that I find in the mountains on this island that I go to is distinguished, distinctive, and can therefore be a new species because of all these characteristics that are different than the others that are out there. And so that's how I use the evolutionary species concept, and I determine whether I'm looking at all one species, all one thing, or whether they're actually differences. Now, when you do this kind of thing, you don't just look at one type of evidence. In my case, I would tend to look at morphology, and we already identified that earlier. This was what things look like, right? In many cases, it's useful to look at molecular data, because if I have things that are a little bit different morphologically, but they're all identical genetically, then they're probably the same. They just look a little bit different, like you and I, right? But if I have good morphological data and I have good molecular data, well, then I can make a very solid case for why I want to describe these things as different species. And that's how we recognize diversity sometimes. You just make a good case for it. So that's part 1.